Bom dia, pessoal. Good morning, everyone. Before turning to English, I have some institutional information to share with you in Portuguese. Este é um evento do Núcleo de Estudos Fiscais da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, FGV, organizado pelo Grupo de Estudos GT7, devidamente cadastrado na instituição e nos órgãos de educação. E se você tiver interesse, poderá acessar pelo website da FGV. Meu nome é Paulo Duarte, eu sou responsável executivo pelo GT7, esse grupo de estudos em tributação internacional, cujo responsável acadêmico é o professor Isaías Coelho. Uma informação importante institucional que preciso ler aqui antes da gente iniciar os trabalhos de hoje, né? O quarto e último dia do nosso webinar sobre os novos acordos para evitar a dupla tributação assinados pelo Brasil. As manifestações expressas por integrantes dos quadros da FGV e pelos convidados aqui hoje presentes representam exclusivamente as opiniões dos seus autores e não necessariamente a posição institucional da FGV. Reiteramos também que todos aqui presentes, palestrantes, moderador e funcionários da FGV, concordaram em participar desse evento de forma espontânea e, com isso, autorizam o uso de sua imagem para essa transmissão, que ficará disponível posteriormente nos canais oficiais da FGV. Now, in English, all statements expressed by FGV, Fundação Getúlio Vargas, employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinion and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here today agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV's official channels. So we are initiating then here today our fourth and final day of our event, the New Brazilian Conventions to Avoid International Double Taxation, a webinar organized by the Center of Fiscal Studies of Fundação Getúlio Vargas, with the aim to discuss the recently signed or renegotiated double tax convention, their details, practical aspects over the bilateral economic relations with the various countries. And today we are going to discuss the double taxation with Singapore. And now I will pass through the stage to my colleague, Felipe, to depict the structure of our event today, to present our speakers, and to conduct the works of our morning. Felipe, the stage is with you. I wish you success in our morning event.
Thank you very much, Paulo. Good morning, everybody. Very early for some, good afternoon for others, depending if they're following us in Europe or farther to the east. It's my pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank Professor Eurico Isaías and, of course, you, Paulo. And I hope that we get a very good, productive day discussing this treaty. The last days were very relevant. I think that the points that were added together with the tax revenue services representatives of Brazil, or even though they were issuing their own opinion, it was very instructive to learn what we could expect from the treaties, for the interpretation of the treaties, and also for the next upcoming treaties. Now, it should be around 9 o'clock in Brazil. For the next 80 to 90 minutes, we'll have the discussion focus on the Brazil-Singapore Treaty. We will have a presentation of 25 minutes by Alexandre Siciliano Borges. Thank you very much for coming here. He's a partner of Lobo de Riso Advogados. He had his LLM done in Leiden in the Netherlands, and he's a specialist in finance and international business by NYU. I also would like to welcome Dr. Irvin Au. He is speaking for 25 minutes to half an hour after Alexandre. He's a partner and director of WTS Tax from Singapore. He's a former tax counsel of the IMF, and he graduated on his doctor in Colombia, and also studied in LSE and US. So welcome you both. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation. It's a pleasure to have you here. We'll continue with a informal presentation if you want, with slides or not, with sharing screens for documents if you wish. We also might have some interaction with the public and the viewers. So I would like to kindly remind the viewers that if you look below, there's a link for sly.do, and this will allow you to submit questions to us, and then we can read, filter, and maybe compile them to give to the speakers. So that's it. Alexandre, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. And yes.
Okay, thank you, Felipe. Good morning to you all. Good morning, Irving. Good morning, Paulo. And thank you for the invitation. Please thank Professor Isaías Coelho and Eurico also. And I had the opportunity to see some of the debates of Monday, Tuesday. They're very nice. It was very interesting to see the position of the Brazilian tax authorities. I think not always we have the chance and the opportunity to see how they think and how they negotiate the treaties. We just see the outcome. The outcome sometimes is good, sometimes we don't agree, but it was very nice to see their rationale about negotiating treaties. So today we're going to talk about the recent treaty signed between Brazil and Singapore. And my first comment is that differently from the Switzerland, the treaty with Switzerland and the Emirates that were approved already in Brazil and in other countries, and is about to they're about to begin to be enforced in January this next year. The treaty with Singapore was signed in 2018, and in Brazil, we are in the process of having it approved. We already have the legislative decree that approved, but we don't have yet the presidential decree. But the message in the Foreign Affairs Ministry is that the treaty is not yet approved by Singapore authorities. So that's what I want to hear later on from Irving, if you have some news about it, because the market is expecting, especially the treaty with Switzerland that is going to be enforced in January. So the market is expecting, and as far as I know, I mean, I don't know too much, but as far as I know, and for the Foreign Affairs Ministry, and the website is saying that the treaty is not yet approved in Singapore. That's why in Brazil, we don't have the presidential decree already. I think they are both, maybe they're both waiting who is going to do the first movement. I don't know. Well, but comparing, start talking about I think it was good to discuss the background for that treaty. In Brazil, the first treaty signed by Brazil was in the 1960s. There was a debate whether the treaty with Sweden and Japan, because as far as I know, I mean, as far as Professor Schwery knows and wrote in an article, the treaty with Sweden was first signed. So that was the first treaty signed by Brazil, and then signed the treaty with Japan, but Japan was first approved. So most people say that Brazil-Japan is the first tax treaty. Then we had France, and during the 1970s, we had a lot of treaties signed by Brazil. I mean, a lot considering the Brazilian tax treaty network. And then we had the treaties in the 80s, maybe 90s. We had around 33 treaties. And then in 2018, we had a shot of 3 treaties: Brazil and Brazil-Singapore, Brazil-Singapore, Brazil-Switzerland. They were both signed in May, if I'm not wrong. And after some time, in 2018, we had the treaty signed between Brazil and United Emirates, Arab Emirates, and they are very similar. They are very similar, and I think the major new thing in these treaties, in those 3 treaties, is the inclusion of a special article to technical services. Brazil has a long-standing position about trying to tax at source technical services as if, I mean, not as if they were royalties, no. But in the protocols, most of the protocols of those almost 30, those around 30 treaties signed by Brazil, the protocol says that the technical services, they can be taxed at source as if Article 12, something like this. So we have been discussing whether this extension, let's say this extension of Article 12 can be applied, but in fact, it was applied for technical services. But in those new treaties, those 3 new treaties, there's a special article, not in the protocol, but in the body of the tax treaty, Article 13. That was inspired by the recent version. I mean, the most recent version of the United Nations model. I think is Article 12 or 12A something in the United Nations. That was approved in 2017. So if you consider that those treaties were signed 2018, they were very innovative, taking the recent approved suggestion by the UN. So before, the protocol says that those services can be taxed at 15%, limited at 15% at source. But the new treaty says that the taxation at source is limited to 10%. So most people are not happy with this article, but in one way. But in other way, the limitation is 10%. So it's good. And I think the debates in the future, maybe we won't see many debates because it's already in the treaty. The thing is that now we still have, for instance, Brazil doesn't have a treaty with the US, one of the major partners, commercial partners. We don't have a treaty with the US. So if a Brazilian source is paying services, technical services to the US, the taxation is 15%. If Brazilian source is paying services to Singapore, to Switzerland, is limited to 10%. So there's I think there's an incentive to have a treaty with other nations. So we still have some very tough positions about transfer pricing, about other issues, but now I think is a little carrot, if I can say, is an incentive to have a treaty with Brazil, because technical services can be limited to 10% instead of the regular domestic rate of 15%. So I think this is the most innovative way. But let's take a step back. So in 2018, why we had those 3 treaties signed? I don't have an answer for that, but probably I would say in case of Singapore, Singapore was listed as a blacklisted country since 2002 in Brazil, in the blacklist. That blacklist was republished in 2010, and Singapore was still there. So Singapore was considered a tax haven by Brazilian tax authorities. We had a broad definition of tax haven, but we had a list at that time. We still have a list, and so at that time, that list in 2010, put Singapore was already there. Switzerland was in that list also, and Arab United Emirates was there. Those three treaties we're talking about. So the market said, no, how Switzerland and Singapore was there already. But after some time, 2017, those three countries, they were revoked from the list. So they were not in the list at that time. And Brazilian tax authorities said, okay, before that, we're going to accept negotiations with those countries if they want to be out of the blacklist. So after some times, so we had the revocation of Singapore, Switzerland, and Emirates from the list. And after some time, we had those three treaties. So probably when tax authorities start the conversation about considering those countries, well, domestic tax rates or transparent entities, they decided to exclude those countries from the list, from the blacklist, but they put those countries, I mean, some kind of legal entities of those countries in the gray list. So Singapore has a lot of legal entities in that gray list. When I say a lot, because the other countries, they say they have one, two, maybe three entities, and Singapore has maybe more than 6, 7, or 10, maybe. By the way, Singapore, I've been to your country, Irving. Very nice. And I drank the very famous drink, Singapore Sling. And so I miss Singapore. It was a long time ago. I was in the Formula One race. And so Singapore was a nice country at that time, and probably now is even nicer. But I think it was interesting to see Victor Polizelli yesterday discussing about the Brazil-Switzerland treaty, and Fabienne from Switzerland. And Fabienne said that the three, maybe four, but the entities, the Switzerland entities, the Swiss entities that are in the gray list, they no longer exist in Switzerland. Have you seen that, Felipe, yesterday? They said, she said, those entities, they don't exist anymore in Switzerland. So I think that Brazilian gray list has to be updated. So my question to Irving is that entities that are in the gray list, do they exist? I mean, are they common in Singapore or not? Or the list has to be updated also? And I think Irving will have the chance to. Do you want to comment now or later on, Irving?
I think I'll do that later.
Okay, good. So we have the treaty with Singapore, and the treaty, besides the Article 13, is like the other ones. They have a very good clause of limitation of benefits. This is it's a modern, let's say, a modern way of signing and building treaties. What else? And the interesting thing to see is that the treaty was signed in the other Brazilian government we had in the past. So in the document where the Foreign Affairs Ministry send a letter to the Congress and to the president in Brazil, it said that the treaty is according to the Brazilian policy of favoring or of incentive taxation at source. But Brazil was import capital country. So nowadays, I don't know if taxation at source makes that. I mean, this is a long debate Okay, this is a very long debate, but was expressed by the Foreign Ministry that the Brazilian-Singapore Treaty follows this trend, this very long-lasting trend of taxing at source. Let me see my notes. And another thing is that the treaty foresees also the MAP, mutual agreement procedure, and since the very first treaty with Sweden, we had this clause of mutual agreement procedure, the MAP, but the MAP was never applied in Brazil at that time. I mean, was very rarely applied, and now Brazil, and I had the opportunity to see, I think, Alexandre from Brazilian tax authorities. I don't remember his last name, but and he was very proud of the new mutual agreement procedures that Brazil is participating. So I think there's a huge chance of having mutual agreement procedures whenever is needed, and this is another incentive to have a treaty with Brazil again. And we are discussing right now the taxation on dividends. I don't know if Irving knows that Brazil doesn't tax dividends. So dividends are tax exempt for domestic recipients as well as foreign recipients, with a treaty or not. So Brazil doesn't tax treaties. That's why our corporate income tax rate is a little bit higher, around 34%, because we don't tax dividends. So we are discussing whether to tax dividends or not, and probably in the future we will have some taxation on dividends also. That future, I mean, the discussion is whether this future can be 2022 or maybe 23, but I think in the future we are going to discuss taxation on dividends, and that is an area where a tax treaty can play a huge difference, because we have a limitation of 10% sometimes, including the treaty with Singapore is limited to 10%. The participation of Singapore resident in the Brazilian entity is required to have at least 10%. No, sorry, at least 25%, and then the limitation is 10%. The Congress was discussing taxation on dividends of 15%. So if you have the chance to have a taxation limited to 10%, will be very nice. So I think this is another incentive to have a treaty with other jurisdictions as well. And the interesting thing to see is that the treaty with Switzerland that was approved at the same time of Singapore requires 10%, the participation of at least 10% in the Brazilian entity, and Singapore is 25%. So I don't know if the Singapore tax authorities were, I mean, I don't know where Switzerland tax authorities, they were tougher than Singapore tax authorities, but they came out with a minimum shareholder participation of 10%, and Singapore is 25%. Most of the Brazilian treaties, they require 25% in order to have the limitation at 10. So I think Felipe, I think basically those were my comments. I'm curious and anxious to see Irving comments, and we can discuss later if you have other doubts or the participants have comments as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. I took the time to quickly look around a little bit around here in the internet, and I found reference in the Singaporean government page saying that the treaty is in force as of yesterday. So So I think that I think our authorities, they're a little bit behind on updating the websites and the information. So I thought,
but not only the website. Let me. I'll try to. Because I
haven't checked on the Brazilian side.
I printed the screen.
Yes.
If you can, let me share with you. Can I?
Yeah, please.
Do you have time to do that?
Yes, we're on time.
Because the foreign ministry here. So this is the PDF page. Can you see?
Yes.
Okay, this is a PDF page of the Foreign Affairs Ministry, and saying that so was approved, was the legislative decree, and the other part. You can see here,
yeah.
Other part, ratification. They don't have information. And when I saw the laws of Brazil, the decrees of Brazil, the page, the main page of the Brazilian legislation, they don't have a presidential decree about the Singapore Treaty. So I think maybe they are about to do it right now, since they have this information from Singapore.
I'm checking now whether the entry into force is different between Brazil or Singapore.
Well, anyways,
yeah.
if they have everything approved, 2021, the treaty is in force in 22 only in Brazil. I don't know in Singapore, but in Brazil in 2022. But we need the presidential decree in Brazil, and I checked yesterday or the day before, and that presidential decree hasn't published yet. Wasn't published yet. Okay, good news. Good news. Thank you, Felipe.
And so, Irvin, you can start with presenting. I don't know if you want to share the slides or make it more informally. We're happy with both.
Yeah, I've got some slides, but I think maybe I'll just start by addressing some of the points that Alexandre has mentioned before, because I tend to have a short memory. So I want to address them before I forget about them. So on the ratification issue, so you are absolutely right, Felipe, that it's actually on the Singapore authorities website that the treaty has been ratified and entered into force as of 1st of December 2021. So, typically, based on my experience with them, they are not going to be putting that up there unless they have already received, there might be a bilateral kind of like exchange of documents to confirm that domestically they have respectively already done the necessary things to ensure that the treaty is now been ratified. And so my belief is that it is in force as of 1st of December 2021, but obviously I defer to you, the experts on domestic procedures in Brazil. But as far as we are concerned, we have been informed that the treaty has been effective as of yesterday. On the issue of the gray list, Alexandre, I think that I looked at that list, and the latest I could find, unfortunately, and I'm not very good at Google, is a 2017 version of it. And there were maybe about 9 or 10 different, they're not entities, they're actually more of tax regimes that we have. So Singapore's tax system actually relies heavily on tax incentives. And these tax incentives could be, for example, the financial sector incentive that applies to banks, investment managers. It could also extend to a lot of the shipping incentives. And all of these were actually listed on the gray list for Brazil, which I would be quick to point out that these regimes have all been under peer review and as part of that whole OECD harmful tax practices process, and they have pretty much been cleared, except for the holding company, which the headquarters incentive, which has already been modified as well. So I think as far as Singapore is concerned, and obviously I don't work for the government, at least not anymore, I don't think I'm in a position to comment for them, but I would say that as far as Singapore is concerned, the general perception here is that these tax frameworks and tax incentives are actually kosher and do not pose any kind of harmful tax practices. So at least from OECD perspective. And the third thing, and I would just want to make a very quick comment, Alessandre, is about the 25% participation requirement for Singapore versus 10% for Switzerland. I would say, well done, Switzerland, because the OECD model is actually based on the 25%. So typically Singapore goes into treaty negotiation with the OECD convention or the UN convention, depending on who the other party is, and use that as a starting point. And they probably have no reason to really look too much into this at this point in time, because Singapore, like Brazil, actually doesn't have a withholding tax on dividends. So actually the dividend provision, at least at this point in time, is basically moot, because neither side would have any use for it. So actually, I only found out that you guys don't have a dividend withholding tax minutes ago. So I suppose that what that really means is that they're probably a little more, they believe that they can set this aside for the time being, and eventually, when it gets to a point where they realize that they are behind Switzerland, they are less advantageous than Switzerland, they might initiate a renegotiation of treaty, but that usually doesn't happen for many years. So I think that's something to look out for. So maybe just bear with me for a minute. Let me share screen. So yes. All right, I hope everyone can see this. So I was told to just give a very quick overview about the bilateral trading relationships between Singapore and Brazil, and that forming a basis for why we should have a double tax agreement. And here you could see the bilateral trade volume between Singapore and Brazil in 2019 was about $3.51 billion US. And obviously a lot of that skewed towards Brazilian to Singapore exports. And so that's about $2.88 billion. Singapore is Brazil's 4th largest export partner in Asia and 16th largest export partner in the world. And on the other hand, Singapore probably exports less to Brazil at about 633 million in 2019, but nevertheless, it's Singapore's 3rd largest export partner in Latin America and 28th largest export partner in the world. So here I think it's more of a trend issue. Between 1995 2019, Brazilian exports to Singapore has actually increased at an annualized rate of 8.95%. That's from 366 million US dollars in 1995 to what we saw in 2019, $2.88 billion. So with the increased volume in trade, you probably want to have some kind of tax certainty that would, which hopefully the DTA would at least partially bring about. And we obviously have a lot more growing ties between ASEAN, which is the region that Singapore belongs to, and the Latin American countries. And so clearly there are opportunities between Southeast Asia and Latin America. And so I just wanted to also highlight a few ongoing bilateral developments between the two countries. As mentioned on the left here, we used to have a limited treaty which entered into force on 20th December 2013. And the new treaty, the comprehensive DTA, signed in 2018 May, has now been ratified and entered into force as of December 1st, 2021, subject to confirmation from your side that it actually is the case. And of course, there's also an FTA, that is a free trade agreement that's currently in negotiation between the Mercosur and Singapore. So that has been delayed, to my understanding, because of COVID, but it's expected to restart quite soon. And it will cover issues like rules of origins of your goods, investments, intellectual property, things that would, once we have a free trade agreement, would further encourage trade between the two countries. And so what does this DTA offer? And this is really, before I go into details as to how the DTA would actually operate, I think there are, it's the same as any other DTA. I mean, the first thing, obviously, is the elimination of double taxation by clearly allocating taxing rights between the two countries, and also aligning certain definitions, what exactly is meant by resident, providing tiebreaker rules, the usual kind of stuff that you find in a treaty. And as mentioned before in the previous presentation, there will be a mechanism that helps to assist in resolving disputes, which is a mutual agreement procedure. And obviously, with this elimination of double taxation, there's the hope that it would promote more FDI, foreign direct investments between the countries. It would help to reduce withholding tax on cross-border investments. For example, interest is reduced to 10% under the treaty, and it would provide greater certainty of tax treatment, and also give a signaling effect that the two countries are likely to engage in a more collaborative kind of relationship, and therefore that is hopefully going to send a positive signal to the market for cross-border trade and investment. And I think the other two are pretty self-explanatory about the treaty itself. So these are just examples of businesses that have invested into Brazil. We have seen quite a bit of investments by the investment funds and sovereign wealth funds, GIC being one of them, in infrastructure, as far as I know. There was a big one that was reported in the news. Sembcorp and Capital were actually also somewhat government-linked companies, and those are in the oil and gas industry. Shopee is one of the big players in Southeast Asia in e-commerce, and my understanding is that they have also made inroads into Brazil in recent years. And on the other hand, you might see some oil and gas companies and mining companies from Brazil investing into Singapore. So these are just examples of some of the transactions that we are aware of. So I thought that instead of I'll share the slides with anyone who cares to take a look at it after, because it's quite a lengthy set. But I thought that it might be good for me to just walk you through some of the differences before and after having a DTA using just a simple holding structure model here, as you see on the screen. So in this case, we are looking at investments from Singapore or through Singapore into Brazil. Now, without the DTA, what happens is that if you look at the bottom of the chart on the left-hand corner, it says that there's a prevailing withholding tax rate on the passive income that applies. Interest, royalties, dividends, apparently it's not taxable in Brazil. So basically, let's say, for example, if your withholding tax on interest is 15%, Singapore is just no different from any other countries. Interest paid to a Singapore holding company, Singapore investors would be withheld at 15% in Brazil. And then what happens is that that income, actually, when received in Singapore, will be taxed at our prevailing corporate tax rate of 17%. But even without a treaty, we do have unilateral tax credits. So we will give you, we would have given you a deduction for the withholding tax that was paid in Brazil. So effectively, then you pay 2%, right? Let's say 15% in Brazil, 17% in Singapore, but get 15% back. So it's 2% in Singapore. So that's how it used to work without the DTA. And of course, if you have business income and you have capital gains from the sale of shares in your Brazilian company, that would be based on whatever domestic rule is in Brazil. I would assume that capital gains from sale of shares in Brazilian companies could be taxable in Brazil as capital gains. And so once that amount is repatriated in Singapore, we don't tax capital gains, so that is not going to be taxable. We also don't tax dividends, foreign source dividends, branch profits, and service fees. And this is because we have a domestic framework called the foreign source income exemption that applies to foreign source income, certain foreign source income received by Singapore holding companies from overseas. So there are some requirements there. It has to be subject to tax in the other country. That country must have a tax rate of at least 15%. And so even though your dividend is not subject to withholding tax, we look at underlying tax paid by the company. So if your corporate tax rate is more than 15%, company has been subject to tax at that rate, not necessarily at that rate, but has been subject to tax, that is good enough. So once the dividend is repatriated to Singapore, it is actually tax exempt. So so that's where we were before without the DTA. So let's take a look on the right now, what happens after we have a DTA in place. So again, let's just look at what, the Brazilian side first. And I think this was alluded to a couple of times now. The withholding tax rate on passive income will be reduced under the treaty. For interest, it's at 10%, royalties as well. I will make an observation here about the royalty provision, which is quite unusual compared to the standard royalty provisions that you would find in the OECD model. So I can only care to speculate why that is the case. I assume that Brazil has pretty strong views about how it wants to tax royalties, and therefore, as a condition for both the removal of Singapore from the blacklist as well as the entering into a tax treaty, probably that is one of the things that was as part of negotiation and given as a concession. I'm purely speculating, I'm not sure, but that was an unusual feature as I was looking through the provisions. And of course, because of the usual allocation rules in the tax treaty, business income, active income will only be taxable if the Singapore holding company has a Brazilian permanent establishment. So that's another thing that has become a little clearer with the introduction of the DTA. And the third thing is that capital gains will not be taxable in Brazil. So from the sale of the shares of the Brazilian company. So if Singapore company decides to sell the shares of Brazilian company, any capital gains would not be taxable in Brazil if the assets of the Brazilian company doesn't consist principally of immovable properties. So that again, is a welcome change, because it will clearly provide some clarity as to whether or not the Singapore company which invests into Brazilian securities is going to be subject to tax in Brazil. And again, with the DTA, the same thing happens. Your dividends that come back will still be exempt from tax. Your branch profit and service fee will still be exempt from tax under the foreign source income exemption rule. And again, your other types of income will be taxable in Singapore, but will be given a foreign tax credit. It's no longer unilateral. It's given under the framework of the treaty, but it's exactly the same thing. You basically get a deduction for the foreign tax paid up to the amount of Singapore tax payable. So there's not going to be any excess credit that's going to come back to you. The other thing that I would kind of highlight to folks here is that for the foreign tax credit, we do have a foreign tax credit pooling system. And what that means is that in the past, we used to have a country by country and source by source approach, which means if you pay tax overseas on this type of income and in this particular country, you are able to then offset the foreign tax credit against that type of income and income from that country only. Now we have a pooling system which allows you to look at the if you have multiple sources, foreign source income, sources of income, we could actually consolidate all of that together. You make an election to have that pulled together, and you can then offset tax paid in one country against income that would have been payable income when payable in Singapore that is derived from another country. So that's basically what we have, which is a foreign tax credit pooling system. There are details as to qualifying conditions. I'm not going to bore everyone with that, but if you're interested, I could, I'm happy to talk about this if you just approach me after the call. And so that was the first structure. The second one is the reverse. So if you have a Brazilian company investing into Singapore, so I think I left a big question mark there whether or not there is foreign tax credit in the absence of DTA in Brazil, because I'm not familiar with your domestic tax framework without a DTA. But obviously, once we have a DTA, there will be foreign tax credit. There should be foreign tax credit given for taxes payable in Singapore to the extent it is provided for in the treaty. So that's the Brazilian side, but on the Singapore side, it's fairly similar to what I mentioned before. We have without a DTA, you would withhold tax on interest on royalties based on the prevailing rates. It's 15% for both, 15% for interest, 10% for royalties in Singapore, but there is no withholding tax on dividend. And so with the DTA, potentially could be reduced withholding tax on on interest, but based on my recollection, what happened is that the 10% only applies to very specific types of loans that has a tenure requirement, and also I think only relates to the infrastructure business, something along that line. So it may not be the most useful if if we are looking at other types of loans. So it may not reduce the interest at all. For business income, again, we will tax business income based on our domestic rules. That is usually, we have a source rule and we use what we call an operations test. So the source of the income really is determined largely based on where the operations that result in the income takes place. So if it's considered to be taking place in Singapore, we will consider that Singapore source, it will be taxed on that business income. With the treaty, what happens is that it's only taxable if there is a Singapore permanent establishment for the Brazilian company. So that's something that, again, with the treaty would have helped with the elimination of double taxation as a result of our domestic rules. And finally, capital gains from sales of shares. We do not have capital gains tax in Singapore, so that's not going to be affected with without the treaty. So that's a comparison really quickly, with and without the DTA. What are the kind of benefits that we can expect? The following slides are really just details as to some of these features that I was talking about in our domestic tax system, as I figured that the audience might be interested in knowing, some of these features that might have interaction with the treaty itself. These are the standard withholding tax rate. If it's a final tax, then it's usually 10% for royalties, 15% for interest and rent, and we don't tax on we don't impose withholding tax on dividends. So again, I figured like maybe we want to have spend some time with questions and answers. So I may not want to go into too much detail here, but we kind of did a bit of comparison between the Brazil-Singapore DTA and the OECD Model Convention, and where are the where the differences lie. So I would maybe highlight, one of which I think might be more interesting is that your construction PE threshold is a little lower under the treaty as opposed to the one under the OECD Model Convention. So it's just 6 months for Brazil-Singapore DTA and 12 months for OECD. And the agency PE definition is one which is based on the older definition. It doesn't take into account the changes as a result of the BEPS project. So agency PE now doesn't just require you to you don't create an agency PE just because a person habitually exercises authority to enter into contract and conclude contract. As long as you play a significant role in the conclusion of the contract and you don't physically do the conclusion of the contract, that is still good enough to create an agency PE for the company in the other jurisdiction. So the Brazil-Singapore DTA, I think I would make a general observation that some of the newer recommendations as a result of BEPS haven't quite been adopted, except maybe to the extent that they constitute minimum standards under the inclusive framework. I think that the rest, I'm just going to point out some of the more important ones. I said the 10% is 5% if you have at least 20, sorry. Okay, so it's 15% in most cases, 10% if the beneficial owner is a company that holds at least 25%. We mentioned about that. For the OECD Model Convention, it's actually 5% if it's at least 25% of the capital of the company. And for interest, under the Model Convention, it's 10%. It's 10%, based on what I mentioned just now. If it is meant for purchase of equipment and has a 5-year loan tenure, that's at 10% and 15% in all other cases. So it's not as favorable, but you take what you get. And for royalties, that's the big difference. Usually resident state has sole taxing rights over royalties. In this case, we give source states taxing rights of 15% if the royalties arise from the use of trademark, and 10% in all other cases. So that's something to take note of. We don't usually see technical services article, and I think, as Alexandre said, that's something which is quite a typical feature in Brazilian DTA. So It just says that the resident state has the primary taxing right, but the source state can tax up to 10%. And which may not be a bad thing, right? Because there's a lot of dispute between royalties and technical services. That's something that we see quite commonly. How much of that do you assign to, in a contract, there's often the royalty itself, but there's also ancillary services relating to that royalty. And if you're going to have two different types of tax treatment or two different tax rates, then it always leads to dispute as to how much goes to technical services and how much goes to the royalty itself. And so, having a technical services article does have that benefit. It's just that it is not something that is aligned with the model convention. So I think I've mentioned about the rest, and I don't think that's too important. So, and the rest are just, our usual standard what's a firm about. So I'm just going to stop here and transfer the proverbial mic back to Felipe.
Perfect. Irvin, thank you very much. That's a very time precise but still comprehensive presentation. I think that on a quick note, I'm very sure that Alexandre has a few points to comment, but on a quick note, Brazil is trying to focus a lot on source taxation, and we have a lot of influence or we have a lot of provisions that more resemble the UN model rather than the OECD model. And I think that this is some of the issues that were pointed out by you. Something that I think it's interesting also because differently from the other treaties that are newer to the Brazilian side, we have for a case to be filed, it can only be filed in the competent authority where you're a resident. So this is a bit restrictive. And I think also put together with the treaty entitlement clause, which is, I don't know, 2 or 3 pages. There's, I think, 8 or 9 paragraphs. This gives a lot of tools to tax authorities. And I think that this is maybe was a bit of a compromise as well from the changes in the black and gray listing. But let's see. Alexandre, if there are any comments from your side, please.
Thank you, Felipe. Irving, very nice presentation with a lot of details that make me feel ashamed that I didn't have all the details you presented to us. So thank you very much. And was interesting to see, first of all, interesting to see that you don't have taxation on technical services. It's a huge issue in Brazil. And commenting that issue, we have a domestic definition of technical services that is very broad and includes expressively digital services without the intervention of a human being, let's say. And the treaty apparently doesn't have a broad definition. Technical services requires technical knowledge. Okay, but I think the domestic definition of technical services doesn't have any doubt about digital services, and I think the definition of the treaty still have some room for discussion of digital services. The other thing is that Brazilian tax authorities, when were negotiating with Switzerland, I think they were in a bad day because the construction PE, the threshold for construction PE we grant to Switzerland is 9 months, not 6 months. So for sure they were in a bad day. They were in a good day when they negotiate. So I think those were my comments, and I'm glad to hear from you that the Singapore entities that are in the gray list, they still exist. But I think it's good to pay attention because in the Switzerland case, probably Brazilian tax authorities, they don't know or they didn't change the gray list yet. So I think it's better to pay attention. If you have a change in those entities in Singapore, maybe it will be good to make a phone call or to send an email to tax authorities in Brazil asking for them to change the gray list.
Yeah, I would say that the Singapore Ministry of Finance and the tax authorities are actually fairly active in monitoring where they stand. And I think Brazil has been a bit of a sticking point for a while, because I think Singapore was pretty upset that it was on a blacklist. So so I think that they would have, to the extent that it's removed from our domestic framework, they would have made that notification. And I would just make one more observation again about the independent, the technical services clause, and that's something which, as you guys have rightly pointed out, is in the UN model rather than in the OECD model. And that really makes sense because countries that tend to be more technical service importing would want to retain that taxing right. So presumably, in this case, Brazil believes that a lot of its businesses are probably purchasing technical services from overseas, and therefore wants to retain that taxing right. And that's nothing to be, I guess, to be too surprised about. Although I think in my head, I've always thought that Brazil was fairly sophisticated, and so I was surprised to see that as coming up. But I've never been to Brazil, so I don't know. But I was a little surprised, mildly surprised by the inclusion of the technical services provision.
Yes.
Okay, Felipe, just
please.
A last remark. So, Irving, please come to Brazil. Okay.
It's a dream. So it's a dream.
It'll be after the pandemic, maybe you can come to Brazil, and I want to visit Singapore once again to drink some more Singapore slings. And I was going to. Oh, I forgot. Oh, okay. You said about the Singapore tax authorities were upset to be listed in Brazil, and I think, unfortunately, I don't know in other countries, but I think this is a practice in Brazil. So Switzerland, so they put in the blacklist, say, come to discuss. I don't know if this is a good idea or not, because I think other countries, they are open to discussion without the blacklist. I think this is a kind of blackmail, to be in the blacklist. I think we did that a few years ago with Ireland, because we had some issues with them in leasing of aircraft. So we put them in the blacklist. Come to discuss. So I think this is not a good practice. I hope the Brazilian tax authorities colleagues are watching this. So I think everybody's open to discussion. I think you don't need to put in the blacklist somebody, because the whole market, you make a big buzz about being in the blacklist. So maybe it's good to discuss without the blacklist blackmailing.
Yeah, but it gives some kind of leverage. I would say that if you look at what the EU is doing with its own black and gray list as well, and that's basically just because otherwise you have zero leverage to ensure that people come to the table. Although I would say that in Brazil's case, it probably can do something to the extent that there is a large, there's a large amount of trade between the countries, and then they're important enough that they want to make sure that they come to you. But then again, look, am I a fan of blacklist? I'm not. But it is not unprecedented, and in fact, maybe the EU took a leaf from Brazil's page, right? In this case, because they only started doing this a few years ago.
This also, just to add, I was here in Austria when Austria was blacklisted, and the mention is made to a regime that doesn't exist. So I totally agree that I don't have the background. I don't know if they tried to have this conversation before with the partner country. But it was listed, and then they came to discussions, and then they had to publish a normative instruction, so administrative legislation on the last or second last business day of the year, because some of the companies that had subsidiaries in Austria, they were freaking out. They did not really know what was to expect, or how to provision money, cash flow, and taxes. Yeah. One question that I would make to the two of you, I think that business-wise, Brazil and Singapore are important and getting more relevant to each other by the year. I think it's a bit of a niche, though, even though we have huge companies like Petrobras, BB, Vale, BRF, and this is all public. It's in the embassy website. It's still, I think, a niche treaty. It's not for the general tax people. I think it's still not really out there. So have you heard any noise from the celebration or negotiation of the treaty, whether it's 50% in force or not? Or do you think this went a little bit more silently?
I can just speak for myself. I have a few clients that had investments into Brazil or are looking into expanding their presence in Brazil, and I think that has been something that's been on their radar for a while. But because it was not ratified for like 2 years, right, more than 2 years, so I think they were quite they weren't even sure if it's ever going to be ratified. But I think they probably have looked at the provisions and thought that it was not as beneficial as opposed to other countries, but it's still better than nothing because there is a good economic case for them to be there, right? So, a lot of times I think we think that tax drives the discussion, but tax actually doesn't drive the discussion. If there's going to be a business case, they are going to be there regardless, but it's still a good thing that, you have some kind of clarity and some kind of reduced tax rate out as a result of the treaty. So I think the general sentiment is a good one, but you are right. It is not, I think if you look at most of the businesses here in Singapore, I don't think Brazil is like super high up on a lot of them on their list of priorities as countries to invest into, but there are niche taxpayers that we're aware of that are looking into expanding the operations in Latin America. And obviously with that, Brazil would be the single largest market that they need to look at, and probably another one which is Spanish speaking. Usually they have like two, and one will be in Central America. Yeah.
Felipe, in my side, I didn't have the chance to discuss the treaty with clients. Although I have some clients that do business with Singapore, grains and but mostly physical goods. Not services, not banks, not insurance companies, where there is room to discuss tax treaties. Maybe we say 101 exports, very basic exports to Singapore, and I thought it was interesting to see Irving commenting, saying that the 2-year time length for the ratification worried about some taxpayers, some companies. This is a good time length in Brazil. 2 years, I would say that this is fast in Brazil. It could be lengthier than that. But I hope, once again, even this is a niche tax treaty. I think it'll be good to increase the business economical relationship between the countries. At least you have the opportunity, like we have now, in an event, to be discussing things about. So I think tax treaties they can work a lot, not in real, in actual transactions, but in the providing the room to discuss. And the exchange of information between tax authorities, nobody knows. I mean, I don't know for sure whether they are exchanging information or not, but the framework is there. So I think we'll be discussing more and more Brazilian-Singapore relationship.
Very good. We had a few comments from the audience, but they were connected with the presidential decree, and that IABFD already had some piece of news informing the entry in force as of yesterday, but Concordia in Brazil, they have not yet confirmed. So we'll do some research after we disconnect here.
And I did also, Felipe, I'm sorry. I did also research in right now, in the page, the Brazilian page about laws, the official page, and there's no decree.
Okay, so it's 50% into force. So yes, if there are any closing remarks from either one of you, this is the time.
Well, in my side, I think I would like to thank you all. Thank you, Irving, for the very interesting presentation. Once again, I think it will be more and more opportunities to discuss this relationship, Brazil-Singapore, and thank you all. FGV, especially for having the room for the debate, including for the debate of international taxation.
So thank you, Alexandre. Thank you, Arvin. And with this, I will pass the mic to Paulo. If you need to make some concluding remarks, as this is the last day and the last event from this series.
Thank you all. These were really very rich presentations. I took note of so many points here in my notebook, and for sure we need to refresh and schedule another event to depict the other points that you interesting proposed and depict here today.
Some case studies.
Yeah, for sure, no doubt. And Singapore became and is becoming even more important for Brazilian companies also going abroad. We are not only importing capital, but we are also going into Singapore to make business. So it's really important to have had also this seminar here with you. Thank you very much. We are finishing here today a series of webinars since Monday, and I hope you did a very successful and interesting participation during these days, and we hope that next year we will for sure make it again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.